Hi, welcome. My name's Claire Edmondson. I'm director of a company called Changing Behaviour. My background is I'm a teacher by trade, and I have worked in a variety of different settings. I started off in a mainstream school called Mellow Lane. What a brilliant name for a school, Mellow Lane. Guess what? It wasn't mellow. Of course it couldn't be mellow with a name like that. It had a high proportion of SEN, lots of deprivation in the area, knife crime, gang affiliation, all the usual things I suppose we see in London schools and outer London schools and further afield now. I had a real passion for working with children with social and emotional health in that school, and I absolutely loved it. I was lucky enough after that job to get offered a job at the Priory Hospital. It is a mental health hospital for young people and adults that have mental health difficulties. My job was a teacher working with young people with mental health difficulties, both catching up with schoolwork and sort of keeping in touch with things whilst they were accessing the support of that service. As you can imagine, thinking about today's training session, I feel very passionate about early intervention for mental health. And I feel really strongly that the more that we can support our young people with those interventions that are more therapeutic, the more better for everyone. Since working for that setting, I've worked in lots of other settings. I've worked in pupil referral units where young people might go if they get excluded from a mainstream school. And sort of day to day now, I run interventions with young people in a mainstream setting, helping them to, reduce the risks of getting excluded. And I also run training sessions like these ones. I'm going to pass you over to my esteemed colleague, Rory, who's going to introduce himself.
Thanks, Claire. Thank you for inviting me to help you today. My name's Rory Hignall. I'm a behaviour support specialist. I started my career as a youth worker, working informally with young people out in the community. This led me to eventually working in a number of schools as a learning mentor and eventually in behaviour support. After about 10 years, I decided to retrain, and I retrained as a parenting practitioner. So I spent a number of years after that delivering many behaviour management programs to parents and foster carers, and learned a lot about managing tricky behaviour certainly in schools and in the home. Now, today, 20 years on, I'm a service lead running an SEMH, so social, emotional, mental health service, which provides support to a number of primary schools for children with additional needs. So, welcome.
Thanks, Rory. Rory and I have worked together for a good couple of years now. I guess we wanted to share our ideas around some therapeutic interventions to support some challenging behaviour. So we've put together a 45-minute short session to sort of reflect that and work through it. This is kind of how we structured it. So I don't think just giving strategies is particularly useful. I think understanding where behaviour comes from, the roots of it, how it affects us, what might be beneath that behaviour is a really helpful model to look at. So we're going to spend predominantly the 45 minutes around that. Then we're going to leave you with some key strategies that will drip feed in as we go through to help in a more therapeutic way. I can't do this training session, Rory can't do this training session without mentioning and focusing on the fact that we have had a pandemic happen. We have been in lockdown. We have a number of children that have been outside of education for a number of months who may or may not face some difficulties going back into school. Sort of whilst I've been in lockdown and I've been working with some key worker students and some vulnerable students in a mainstream school, and it's been really useful to work with those students. I've also been writing a paper around the impact that COVID-19 will have on behaviour. And I just wanted to put together here a few of the things that I've discovered in some of my research. I've looked at a study from China where they thought about the anxiety behaviours and symptoms that primary age children have had since COVID-19. And there's been a 3% increase in anxiety symptoms in primary age children. And when I was reading that, I was like, oh, that's not a particularly exciting statistic to put into any sort of training or paper. But actually, when you start to work out the raw numbers, it becomes quite an interesting statistic, if I can say it, because 3% of a big secondary school is a class of 30, isn't it? In a smaller primary school, that might only be 20 pupils. But if we topple on the fact that we've already got a mental health crisis going on within our young people, within our adult community as well, if we couple that, then we might have, you know, many more children that are showing challenging behaviour based on mental health difficulties and social and emotional health difficulties, maybe 30 more, maybe 20 more in your setting. So that's quite a frightening statistic when we start to look at it in rawer numbers. I also wanted to focus on some of the research from this country. This is more aimed at sort of young people and secondary age pupils. That Young Minds conducted a survey, and they were trying to find out the proportion of young people that already had mental health difficulties, to kind of find out if their mental health difficulties had got any worse and they'd had more symptoms. And 32% said that their symptoms and their mental health had become worse during lockdown, during the pandemic. I mean, that's massive. So we might have in schools children already that have social and emotional health, and perhaps their difficulties might get worse based on that evidence. And we might have a group of children that never have shown anxiety-based behaviours or anxiety-based feelings, and actually we might have more that come into school in that, you know, state already. So some of those statistics are absolutely frightening for me as a practitioner working with vulnerable children, you know, in and across different settings. I also wanted to think about our BAME communities, because we know from studies from the NHS that I've referenced at the end that the BAME communities have faced more difficulties from the pandemic, a higher death rate, a higher infection rate. I think relating that back to the training today, it's always worth remembering that young Black Afro-Caribbean men are the most likely group to get excluded from school. And I think remembering that and thinking about unconscious bias and all of those different factors to make sure that we're on point with supporting all of our communities within our school, and honouring the fact that our BAME communities may well have faced and statistically would have faced more difficulties than others. And I think remembering that and supporting as much as possible is really important. When I'm thinking about any sort of training, I'm thinking about the relationship at the heart of what we do. This 45-minute session isn't about loads of strategies, you know, that we're just going to fire out at you and ask you to go away with. Actually, what we want you to do is really think about the impact that we can have without actually taking up too much time, things that we can naturally do that don't cost anything. And I really love this quote when I'm thinking about this sort of intervention, which is one friend, one person who is truly understanding, who takes the trouble to listen to us as we consider a problem, can change our whole outlook on the world. And really, as practitioners working in schools, that's our job, isn't it? That's what we want to do to our young people and children, to help them have a better outlook, to build that relationship. This quote makes me think of a young person that I worked with when I worked in one of my settings. It was my first week working in that setting, and one of the lads was just so rude. He was throwing things around. I didn't know him, you know, I hadn't built a relationship, and he was so vile to me. And it actually really triggered me, because I'm not used to young people taking such offence to me. I'm actually good at my job. I like young people, I can build relationships, but he was one that it just wasn't working. And it got to the end of that week, and we had a staff meeting about that student. And I found out a bit more about his background. And I found out that he had previously tried to take his own life. He had abusive circumstances at home. So now I'm thinking about that behaviour in a different way. I'm thinking, well, actually, that isn't a young man giving me a hard time. That's a young man having a really, really hard time. What I really wanted to acknowledge with that student is not the difficult experiences that he'd had, but for him to feel safe around me and for me to build a relationship. So lots of what I did and lots of what I thought about were that relationship and how I could make him feel safe. The first thing I did was I gave him an object, a pen, and we sometimes call them transitional objects. And it was something that I gave to him as a present with his name on, and he could take that pen to any lesson, and he had it with him at all times. And the reason that sort of small intervention, just a pen, was really useful was that it connected him to an adult that he felt safe with. So every time he held the pen, he felt connected to me. So for a 14-year-old boy, that sounds like a bit of a strange intervention, but actually it was really successful, and it did help us to build a connection. I also made sure that he had access to a safe space, and that might sound like a bit of a funny phrase, but a safe space is just where someone can go to if they're feeling escalated, upset. There's no consequence for going to that space. It's somewhere to reflect, calm down, relax, all of those things. And I did set up a safe space for him, and that really helped him to be able to take a bit of time out from lessons when he needed them and to have a bit of cool down time. So just a couple of things that I did with that student that took hardly any time, that were really just about me being that understanding person that understood that he wasn't giving me a hard time. He really was having a hard time, you know, as a young man, navigating all those difficulties. Thinking about that young man, thinking about the behaviours that he showed to me when I first met him, I think it's really useful for us all as practitioners to think about the behaviours that really frustrate us. So if I'm thinking about behaviours that really, really frustrate me in school, I've probably got quite a long list, to be honest. But some of them are really, really centred around equipment. Like, I find it really, really difficult if a child starts to destroy special equipment that I might have bought in. And that's a really small thing. For someone that's worked in behaviour units and had all sorts of behaviour thrown at them, to be annoyed, frustrated, upset at a broken pen or something seems, you know, really trivial. But it's just one of those things where if I've gone the extra mile, I kind of feel quite upset if someone, you know, is ruining that extra mile or throwing it back in my face as I perceive it. I don't know about you, Rory. What behaviours frustrate you?
Well, Claire, even with all my years of experience of working with children and challenging behaviour, to this day, I think the thing that still really frustrates me is when someone's deliberately unkind to somebody else. Not to me. I can deal with it if it's directed towards me, but it's when I watch, for example, pupils being deliberately unkind or being mean or picking on somebody else, somebody smaller, or, you know, picking on the way that somebody looks. I really do find that quite difficult, and it does cause me some frustration. And like I said, even though I've got all these years of experience, that to this day that still affects me. And I have to remind myself really that, you know, that all of these behaviours, there's always something behind it that's driving it.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point about what drives that behaviour. And I think back to that student that I've mentioned quite a lot, that I wish that I'd known the information earlier so I could understand where the behaviour was coming from, because that empathy and understanding helps us, doesn't it, to sort of be able to navigate those difficult and challenging behaviours that we sometimes see. I don't know, you know, you guys listening at home and thinking about your students, maybe this is a really good opportunity to think about what behaviours from your children really do frustrate you. Now, we can talk about students frustrating us, but we have to flip the coin, don't we? We have to think about ourselves and be reflective practitioners, so we can think about therapeutic ways to manage some of the behaviours that we see. So it's really important that we also look at what we do that might fuel some of the behaviour. I'll be really reflective now. I'm always very happy to, as Rory knows, to say all of my faults and the things that I do wrong. One of the things I've noticed that I can be guilty of in triggering young people is that I'm quite smiley. Sometimes I'm smiley at the wrong times. I was working with a young man this week, running a short session with him, and he was saying something that was actually very ironic because he sees things quite in black and white, so it was quite an ironic statement, and it actually made me laugh because it was quite funny because it was so ironic. And he literally shouted at me, "Why are you laughing at me?" And I honestly put my hand on my heart, it was just because it was such a funny statement. But he said to me, "No, I'm being really serious." And I'm quite guilty of that, where I can trigger children and young people because I can smile at the wrong time or sort of, yeah, show my teeth at the wrong time. And that's something that I always try and work on. Like even doing training sessions and things, I can smile at the wrong time, and I have to be quite mindful that I always want to grin at all of those things. So yeah, that's one of mine, and I think it's useful for me to bear that in mind. What about you, Rory? Anything that you possibly could do that frustrates children or young people?
I think something I often do, and I still do it to this day, is forget the importance of the relationship. I think, you know, we need to give time to building relationships with young people. And sometimes we are, you know, all of us are under pressure to get things done quickly. There's never enough hours in the day. But really, we should be making time to build these relationships with young people. And often I find that if I haven't had time to do that, haven't had time to get to know a young person, but I'm still expecting them to follow my agenda or follow my instructions or my commands. And then I reflect on that and how frustrating that must be for young people when adults around them are not taking the time to get to know them. I think there's a number of other things as well which I'm aware of, and I think everyone listening to this will have experienced these. These are just things we have to do when we work with children. Sometimes we have to say no to them. That causes huge frustration for them. Sometimes we have to ask them to do simple things like pick up a pen, do some work, write a sentence. These are all triggers that can really cause frustration in young people. There are other things that are against us that sometimes that are unplanned as well, such as like transitions. You know, sometimes we need to move from one situation to another. Sometimes there's going to be unplanned changes as well, like staff changes, or, you know, you might have had to completely change your lesson plan for one reason or another. So I think that there are we could go on, the list could go on, but there are a number of issues that we face that will cause frustration in young people.
It's really interesting you say about the changes in staff, because that's going to be a huge one, isn't it, when children and young people go back, or if they haven't been back already. I know in the pattern that I'm working at the moment, I do certain fixed days, and I might be working with someone that has quite black and white thinking and has autistic traits. And actually, if I change those days, that is a real issue, and it's something that I need to prepare that child for. And I suppose, leading on from what you said, that it's that preparation for change that's really important, isn't it? But we can't always do it because, you know, during a pandemic, we're going to have unplanned changes more so than before. I suppose the flip side might be that maybe, you know, children will be quite resilient to some of those changes. I don't know. Time will tell with some of those. I think for, you know, you listening at home and thinking about your young people, it's really important that we do reflect on what we might be doing that might be influencing, you know, some of those behaviours. And it's that sort of reflective practice which can really help our children to not escalate and to stay nice and calm within our settings. And that's an important aspect of what we're trying to cover today. We've touched upon this, haven't we? And this is such a common thing that you'll see in different behaviour training. It's the metaphor of the tip of the iceberg being the behaviour, and then everything that's underneath it is what's driving that behaviour. So I've put an example on here with different layers. I've talked about a behaviour might be someone shouting at a teacher, and that's the behaviour that we see. So that's above the ocean. Then underneath the ocean, there will be all the driving factors. So we might have some internal factors where that child may have a lack of relationship with the teacher, leading on from what Rory has talked about with relationships. Maybe a misunderstanding of the boundaries and the rules within that classroom. The external factors might be the fact that it's a noisy classroom. And then some biological factors might be that the child has sensory perception difficulties, maybe a lack of self-awareness, oversensory hearing. All of those things could be biological factors that feed into it. So when we're thinking about the tip of the iceberg, the behaviour, it is important to try and delve and investigate underneath and wonder what's driving that behaviour. And we always use this sort of phrase in sort of behaviour-based training, but what is the behaviour communicating? And if we can try and figure that out, if we can try and empathise from where that behaviour is coming from, it helps us as practitioners to change our behaviour so we can deal with it in the best way that we can. And understanding this sort of model will help us to be able to understand some of our children even better. And ultimately, that's what we want. I'm really keen on any training that I run, and I know Rory's the same, is that we can't just talk about behaviour and just think about children. We've got to talk about looking after ourselves. We work in a really, really stressful profession. We also are now working in a profession where things are forever changing, like Rory mentioned, where plans might change at the last minute. So we ourselves are lacking the stability and the safety that we normally have. So our anxiety levels, our stress, all of those aspects are going to be higher than they usually would. And they would have been higher before this anyway. So I think I've just put down a few things that I think are really useful for us to think about looking after ourselves so we're able to look after others. And I put breath on there, about taking a deep breath across the day, because sometimes we might get to the end of the day and think, I haven't even taken a breath, I haven't had a chance to think and breathe. One way I try and combat this myself is that with some of my students, I might put on a mindfulness video or something similar to that, because I'm not the sort of practitioner that can sit there and and lead mindfulness myself. I wouldn't necessarily feel comfortable. But putting on a short mindfulness video, maybe 5 minutes, where I can take deep breaths, my students and children can take deep breaths, it's a win-win for everyone. And I think if we're thinking about children returning to school after the pandemic, it becomes imperative that we have that sort of mental health well-being time factored into the curriculum, that it isn't just let's get on academically, let's make sure that we have those chances for calm and well-being for teachers and children alike. So having that as part of the curriculum, I think, is really important. Taking breaks, if we're able to, is really good for our well-being and our self-care. Changing the plan, we've just talked about how that can escalate children, but we don't mean to do it to escalate children, but more to think about being flexible. Because if we're not flexible, it can make it really difficult for us to look after ourselves. So having that flexibility in our workplace, where we might have to change the plan, and accepting that things might be different, which is really hard in a pandemic world. The self-care at home is where we're thinking about the routines and sort of methods that we have at home to look after ourselves. I personally like to do lots of exercise and get out in the fresh air and nature, and all of those things, they really help my mental health. Lots of other things I like to do: reading, listening to music, as those of you that might know me, looking after my dog and spending time with my dog is something that often makes my mental health a lot better. But it's really, really important right now for your young people that you are able to look after yourselves, because you're gonna be looking after them in September. So it's important that you start to make sure that you're looking after yourselves. The last one, talking to others, this is something that I can't advocate enough for. Personally, during lockdown, I've been working with key worker students 2 times a week. And for me, that has been absolutely wonderful to have face-to-face contact with people away from home. But having access to a staff group to talk to them about the pandemic, to talk to them about how I'm feeling and finding things difficult, I've actually made some friends during that time at that school that I wouldn't necessarily have made otherwise. But that talking to others has really helped me, and being open about how I'm feeling has been really useful. So I feel that the self-care, looking after self so we can look after others, is a really key message. This is more, again, thinking about how experiences drive behaviour. So Rory once told me a story about a time when he got stung by a wasp. When was that, Rory? When?
It was probably about 5 years ago, and it's the only time I've ever been stung by a wasp, and I can still remember it like it was yesterday. Very much like that photo. That actually isn't my arm in that picture, but I did get stung on my arm, and I tend to have, I do have a lot of allergies, so I tend to have quite a nasty reaction to any sort of stings, like nettles or hay fever. I got stung by a wasp and my arm had swelled up. Left me feeling extremely unhappy and extremely edgy. Following that, every time I heard any sort of buzzing insect in the room, I thought it was a wasp. And to this day, I'm exactly the same. If I hear a wasp or even just a fly or any insect, I'm like very much on edge, trying to find where it is and trying to get away from it. So yeah. Not nice feelings.
No. Oh, horrible. Yeah, I've been stung more times than that, but not had that reaction. And I suppose if we're relating that back to this model, we're thinking about the experience of getting stung by a wasp from Rory, affects his feelings. So he was worried, anxious, angry, in pain, all of those things. But I think what's really interesting is the perception, that the perception of a fly coming into the room affects Rory's behaviour. But the interesting thing is that fly is not a wasp, it's just a perception. So his behaviour changes despite something not being the actual thing. So I think that's a really interesting point about behaviour, that sometimes we can see behaviours that are just based on perceptions and not based on real things. So they might be imagined, circumstances in someone's mind. I think we can relate this back to ourselves as practitioners, relating it maybe to a child that we have in our class or our settings that shows challenging behaviour. And if we persistently have difficult experiences with them, it can make us feel a certain way towards that child. So we might feel quite negative about that child coming in. We might think, oh no, not them again, or oh no, not this class again. We might feel those different things. As they're about to come into the classroom, my perception of that class or that child or that behaviour is that, oh, it's going to happen again. This is going to be a rubbish lesson. This child's going to show this behaviour. So my perception and my way of thinking is already very negative. As that child comes into the classroom, lo and behold, my behaviour changes. So I might have very subtle nuances, very subtle changes. So I might have my arms folded and just be sort of, lacklusterly greeting them at the door. Or I might flick quite quickly if someone says something, and I might blow it out of proportion because I'm already expecting that behaviour is going to come. So we can see how quite easily challenging behaviour can kind of get caught in this loop, where experiences drive feelings, drive perceptions, that drives behaviour. And I think actually where the weakest link is, and it might help Rory with his flies and wasps, is around the perceptions, that our perceptions are the weak point in that model. So if we change that perception, hopefully, we're thinking about children with challenging behaviour, perhaps we could change a perception to, oh, today's a good day, or oh, this is going to be a good lesson, or I know I'm going to give that child a job, or I'm going to have a really nice time with that child and be really positive. Not always, but sometimes those perceptions can then change the model. So we might be more positive in our behaviour, which then creates positive experiences for that child and for myself as a practitioner, and then we go all the way around the loop again. So I think that model has served me quite a lot for me to think about my practice. Also relating to that model, we've got the idea that we can't sort of solve everything. So we might have some children and young people that might become escalated when we're working with them. This is from a model from Kaplan and Whelan from 1983, and it's still used in lots of different training. It's called the assault cycle. I'm really interested in this model, thinking about COVID-19, thinking about people arriving back into school in September that may not have accessed school for a long time, and I'm thinking about staff and students here. I am predicting that lots of people will be arriving at trigger phase A, so where they're already showing signs of anxiety. Rory, what do you think some of the signs might be in that first phase, that anxiety phase?
Well, the difficulty with the trigger phase is that it's not always very obvious. Many years of experience that I've had working with young people who experience anxiety and will arrive in the setting that I'm working in already in a heightened state. It's not always physically obvious. Sometimes things like you can tell that their heart rate is raised, or their breathing's a bit more laboured. So their chest might be moving, or even their eyes might be a bit more movement in their eyes. I mean, I've worked with some young people that blush. The skin will flush and blush. Young lad that I used to work with, I knew when he was in a heightened state, he would the back of his neck would turn red, or even pupils dilating. So a lot of these physical signs can be really, really, really subtle in many young people. So when they arrive on your doorstep or in your classroom, how can you tell whether they're triggered or not? It's something really important to reflect on there.
Yeah, drawing on that, how can you tell if someone's triggered, particularly if some of those behaviours or those feelings are quite internalised? And it may be such subtle nuances, as you say, that we're not necessarily able to spot it. I'm really thinking about phase A in supporting some of the schools and settings that I work in, and really thinking about that phase A and predicting that we're going to have more children, more adults at the phase A of this crisis cycle. So thinking about how we start the day to identify those children and those adults and staff members that are in that phase, and what we can do to support them. I'm a real advocate and a fan of soft starts. I know you support quite a lot of schools that offer that sort of start, where it might be a soft start to the day where it's structured but not overly structured, and it gives a chance for calming activities and different things to kind of get a grip of where our students and children are at and where staff are at. So that's something that I would definitely think about within phase A of the trigger stage. I'm also thinking about safe spaces. I mentioned that with the student that I worked with, that I supported. And I think that having a safe space or a Thrive place for children to go to if they are struggling is such an important thing. And that check-in in the morning. So as well as a soft start, we might have key students that we know are going to have a difficult time coming back into school, and thinking about identifying a key person that they can check in with first thing in the morning and just have a quick chat. How are you today? How is everything? Talk to me. All of those nice things. And if we're getting it right at phase A and phase B, and hopefully avoiding those huge escalations and having those soft starts, having those safe spaces set up and preempting that behaviour might come, I think actually will reduce a lot of that anxiety and worry. But I think that's a really useful model to think about. And I suppose my lasting point with it is really thinking about how many people are going to be arriving through the school gates already in phase A, and I would predict it will be a lot more than we had before, based on the evidence that I drew on from Chinese primary age children. I think it's a decent prediction to make, and if we can predict, hopefully we can make some changes with some of those therapeutic interventions. But yeah, it's a useful model to look at.
So thinking about that escalation from the trigger to crisis, it's helpful to remember that when a person reaches crisis on the assault cycle, that it can also be described as reaching survival mode. And what happens when we reach survival mode is that adrenaline enters the bloodstream, and this acts as a trigger which causes many changes in the body and the mind. So for example, it will cause an increase in the heart rate. It will redirect blood flow. It causes huge surges of energy, and also shuts down various functions of the brain temporarily. So this is not a conscious thought. This is something that the person does not have control over in those instances. So it's actually a stress response as a reaction towards danger, whether it's perceived danger or actual danger. So that's why we've got the very scary picture of a bear here on the slide with the words fight, flight or freeze. So many of you will heard of the term fight, flight or freeze. So what I've just described there is the survival mode, or a stress response. And like I said, it's not a conscious thought. It's a survival reaction from when we're in this mode. So if a bear were to come in the room right now, and there were a number of us sat around, a percentage of us would fight the bear. We would attack it, and that would be our primary survival response. Another percentage of the people in the room would flight. So they would clamber over each other, jump out of windows, open doors and run for it to get away from the bear. But then finally, you've got freeze. So freeze would be another response. Again, you don't have any control over it. You might have this very scary bear coming towards you, but your body and your mind just causes you to freeze. Unfortunately, you might be at more of risk at that point. So it's just helpful to kind of remind ourselves that when the young people that we're working with that are coming back to schools potentially are going to escalate to crisis, and it's just as a little reminder, just remember that if they do turn to survival mode, that we need to be putting in as many strategies as possible to try and protect them. We want to sort of stop them from looping back into crisis. So I know Claire's going to talk a bit more about that.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I was reading a paper from the Tavistock and Portman about the impact on trauma on the pandemic and COVID-19. And what was really interesting, and I think this relates to children as well as adults, is that just looking at the news during the pandemic and reading sort of frightening headlines can trigger people into that survival mode, because everything becomes less secure and less safe as soon as you look at the news and see that horrible news. And I think that's really interesting for us all to think about, thinking about the news that children might be accessing, whether they can understand some of the biases and the differences in the news and what's reliable news, what's fake news. And I thought that was really interesting, you know, that just looking at the news could trigger people into this fight and flight response, children and adults included. So I think being careful, you know, along with our therapeutic interventions, but being careful about how much we talk about it and being factual and careful with what we say about it without being too emotive about the pandemic, because there is so much emotive language in the media. But that was something just to add on, thinking about that study that I looked at. So what we try to do with the, you know, short 45 minutes that we've got is give you a good bit of theory and examples, you know, to help you think about some of your children and some of the therapeutic interventions that you can do that don't take any time really, that just, you know, are part of our response and understanding of behaviour. And now we just want to talk about a few scripts, so a few things that we can say if we see that someone is showing challenging behaviour and how we can support them. I've just jotted down a few here, so I use this loads in my setting. I might say I care about you if someone's having a difficult time. It's not because I'm just reading a script, it's because I do care about the students that I work with and they know that, and particularly when they're having a difficult time, I really want them to remember and remind them that I do care about them. I want you to feel safe, and I've talked about feeling safe and that sort of safe word quite a lot, because especially during the pandemic and during lockdown, lots of young people and adults alike haven't felt safe. So it's really important that we remind them that we want them to feel safe, even though we acknowledge that they may not feel safe now. That's what we want for them. The I statements: I understand how you're feeling. I understand that you're angry. It's acknowledgement, isn't it? And that's a really powerful script to use when we think about more therapeutic ways of communicating. I'm wondering if Rory might mention something about I'm wondering if.
Yeah, it's a strategy that I use a lot with young people, especially when you've got young people that are in a heightened state, bearing in mind that when they're in that heightened state, they're not necessarily going to be able to process things rationally, and their conscious thought's going to be hindered somewhat. So quite often I use I'm wondering if as a sort of rhetorical question. So I'm wondering if Claire is feeling upset, or I'm wondering if Claire needs to take a break. I can use it in a number of different ways, but I'm certainly not expecting an answer from Claire. What I'm actually trying to do is encourage Claire to think. So I'm trying to de-escalate, bring her down from where she's at, and encourage her to think. So quite powerful. You can use it in lots of creative ways.
So you're wanting me to take a break now, is that?
Yeah.
Thanks, Rory. I use that one quite a lot. I know in the early year settings that I support and do some training with, that I'm wondering if statements are really good for emotional literacy, aren't they? So yeah. You're thinking about helping that child to understand the emotion that they're having, because they may not quite be there with understanding all the rumblings that's going on, you know, within their emotion. So that they're lovely statements to use. But What I think is interesting about all of these statements and phrases is that these aren't just for a certain age group. I've used these across the age groups that I've worked with, from adults all the way down to younger children. So I think they cross all barriers. I've used this with staff as well that have been really upset because it's a nice way of opening up conversations, especially the talk to me. That's one that I've used time and time again with escalated students and children, because it's a statement rather than saying, would you like to have a chat with me? Because the answer might be no for someone that's upset, but just a really open statement, talk to me, invites that conversation. And I want to help is a good one. Saying the person's name, I can see that you're upset. Let's go and get a cup of tea. Let's go and have some fresh air. So we're trying to help remove that child or young person from the difficult situation that they're in. So they're tried and tested. I mean, they're nothing new. I'm sure that you've used statements like these, but I think it's about being on point with them, about being on point with knowing what my body language is doing whilst I'm delivering those sorts of scripts, and just remembering a few sentences in them that in those moments will help that child feel safe and grounded, rather than feeling maybe attacked by lots of questions and demands. We're just helping to support them in that moment. I just wanted to really leave it, and Rui and I planned it in this way, just to have a few key words to leave you to think about moving forward with managing challenging behaviour. Prevention has really come up across the whole training, that we need to think about those children coming back into school that haven't accessed school for months on end. If we know that they were challenging before, we can plan and have a good idea that they might be challenging when they come back. And actually, if we can prevent some of the escalations by preempting that behaviour, by having a plan in place for them, a behaviour plan, and not just risk assessments. I know that we'll be doing risk assessments, but having that behaviour plan in place of what we're going to do if they're escalated. What do we do? And we've suggested quite a few different things that really don't take any time and are quite straightforward humanist sort of approaches. Things like having a safe space, things like connecting, building relationships like Ruri talked about. Things like transitional objects, really straightforward, small things that can help someone to feel connected. The natural consequences is where, of course, children need consequences and need, to learn different things from behaviour. But by natural consequences, we mean the action should match the consequence. So if someone draws on the wall or does graffiti, a natural consequence would be that they have to rub it off with an adult or a staff member and to talk about what happened. That would be a really natural consequence for someone's behaviour. So where possible, using consequences that follow the action can help someone to learn and modify their behaviour. Restoring after a crisis or after challenging behaviour. I've had to do that this week. I wasn't on form with one of my students that I was working with. I was hot, bothered, stressed, all of those things, and we didn't have the best interaction. And I made it my point the next day, because it was troubling me, to find that lad and say, look, I'm really sorry, I wasn't on good form yesterday. I managed to wheedle out an apology from him, because he wasn't on very good form either. And we had that restoration process, and actually it will make our relationship stronger in the long term. And it's my business to do that as a practitioner, because A, I care about my students, and B, I know that if I can restore and build our relationship, it will only make it stronger. Reflection is something we've talked about across this whole section. I know Ruri and I are both really reflective practitioners. We must reflect on our own practice, not so we criticise ourselves and like, oh, I've done this wrong, I've done that wrong, but be really proactive. So this didn't go right. What do I do differently next time about it? How do I feel about it? What can I do to make changes that improve my practice, that improve the relationship that I have with my children? And it's that reflective practice that makes the best practitioners, and it makes the best teachers or TAs or whoever's working in school, where we reflect on those things without being overly critical and really make those changes that will help our children feel better. And to leave you on the note with these strategies, that safety is so important. And I'm not just talking about the risk assessments that you have to do based on, you know, sharing pens and all of the stuff we'll have to do in a COVID world, but really thinking about, can we make our staff and children feel safe in our setting so they're ready to perform to the best of their ability? If people don't feel safe in their settings, then they're not going to be able to do that. So things like having clear routines back in place as much as possible, having our clear timetables, consistency in our behaviour management strategies where we can, having a safe space like we've talked about is a really nice way of helping people to feel safe within their settings. So we must really focus on that feeling safe and secure for everyone going back into schools to manage challenging behaviour. And I think, and I know Rory thinks the same, that will really help schools moving forward. So we've gone through a fair few things in a short space of time, and I guess we're calling it an introduction to therapeutic strategies to help, because in 45 minutes you can only cover so much. We've looked at the roots of behaviour, and we've given you some practical strategies that we've kind of littered through and then summarised at the end for you. Few references that I draw upon for some of the research that I've been doing on COVID and mental health, and then obviously the Kaplan and Whelan that we looked at as well. So just to leave you with a final thought, I hope you all stay safe and well, and really hope that you found this session useful. My name is Claire Edmondson, I'm Director of Changing Behaviour, and Rory will say goodbye.
Yeah, and I'm Rory Hignall, and thank you very much, everyone. Hopefully see you all again.
Okay, stay safe.
Stay safe. Bye.